Long before the headlines, before the guns and street wars, there was simply Gooch Close. In the early 1980s, this corner of Moss Side, Manchester, wasn't yet synonymous with fear. It was a place marked by poverty, disenfranchisement, and deep-seated tension between young black communities and the police. This was the soil from which the original Gooch Crew emerged, a group of teenagers, mostly second-generation Caribbean immigrants, who found identity and protection in numbers. The gang wasn't organized crime from day one. It was survival, from racist attacks, from unemployment, from a society that had written them off. These early Gooch members didn't wear uniforms or post on social media. Their identity came through loyalty, territory, and mutual protection. When the police arrived in Moss Side, often in riot gear, these youths banded together not out of criminal intent, but out of necessity. Gooch became their answer to systemic neglect. As the decade wore on, the crew grew bolder. Petty thefts turned into burglaries. Cannabis became cocaine. But through it all, one thing remained constant. Gooch was there before anyone else, before names like Cabo and Piggy even appeared on the scene. They began experimenting with low-level drug sales, mostly cannabis and amphetamines. The money wasn't massive, but it was consistent. And more importantly, it gave these young men a sense of control in a world that constantly tried to take it from them. They became known, respected in their postcode. And while not all embraced the path of violence, the Gooch name began to carry weight. This original generation laid the groundwork, the codes, the loyalties, the street sense. They didn't have flashy nicknames or viral notoriety. What they had was grit, and a commitment to each other that would echo across generations. Yet history often forgets the foundation when new names take the spotlight. Gooch in the 80s wasn't about brutality. It was about belonging, an understanding that legacy is essential to grasp the full story. Because long before YG Cog, Cabo or Piggy, there was just Gooch, raw, unfiltered, and very real. By the mid-1990s, the Gooch Gang had established itself firmly in the streets of South Manchester. But as the original members matured, a new faction began to rise from within. YGCOG, Young Gooch Close Original Gangsters. Unlike their predecessors, YGCOG wasn't just reacting to the world around them, they were shaping it. They grew up idolizing the OGs, learning the game not from TV or hearsay, but directly from the source. YG Cog was more calculated, more organized, and increasingly violent. They inherited a neighborhood already claimed, but sought to expand it. With the drug trade booming, these young gangsters took operations further. They established deeper ties with suppliers, managed lookouts with walkie-talkies, and coordinated drops across neighborhoods. The streets weren't just wild, they were now mapped and monetized. YG Cog introduced a new level of sophistication. Instead of relying on brute force alone, they implemented systems for tracking debts, hiding stashes, and moving narcotics with precision. Some members even dabbled in fraud, using cloned credit cards and mobile scams to supplement drug profits. The gang evolved from a street-level outfit to a semi-structured enterprise. Key figures in YG Cog weren't as media-known as Joyce or Amos, but they were just as influential in shaping the gang's internal culture. They maintained loyalty, imposed discipline, and ensured that disrespect, from rival gangs or within, was swiftly handled. But YGCOG wasn't just about violence, it was also about inheritance. These members saw themselves as successors to a legacy, the next link in a chain that stretched back more than a decade. They kept the Gooch name alive, not as a copy, but as an evolution. This phase of the gang also marked the beginning of a more pronounced divide between generations. While older members tried to enforce certain rules and boundaries, YG Cog tested limits, sometimes clashing with those above them. It was this internal tension, combined with external pressure from rival crews, that would soon set the stage for further fractures. Still, for a time, YGCOG brought cohesion. They were feared, respected, and dominant. But just as they were reaching their peak, fate dealt them an unexpected advantage. an opening that would change the balance of power across Manchester. While Gooch and YG Cog were solidifying their grip, another gang across town was experiencing a collapse, the Dodington Crew. Known for their own street presence and history of violence, Dodington had always been a match for Gooch. The two groups had clashed frequently over turf, reputation and resources, but in the late 1990s and early 2000s, an extensive police crackdown changed everything. Operation Cougar, among others, led to the arrests of several high-ranking Dodington figures. Raids swept through Longsight and surrounding areas, netting drugs, weapons and suspects. In one swoop, the Dodington hierarchy was gutted. What followed was a period of confusion and vulnerability. Without their seasoned leaders, many of Dodington's younger members were left without direction. Some went underground. Others tried to fill the vacuum but lacked the respect or experience to hold things together. Gooch, watching from the wings, moved quickly. With rivals weakened, they pushed further into contested territories, setting up new drug routes, planting loyal lookouts, and enforcing their presence through intimidation. The balance of power shifted almost overnight. It was during this time, in the early to mid-2000s, that lesser-known but locally significant names like Cabo and Piggy rose to prominence. They didn't rise through legacy or internal promotion. They filled a gap. They became visible faces of Gooch dominance during a rare moment of near-total control. Their reign wasn't long, maybe 2 years, but in that short window they became symbols of Gooch's renewed presence and aggression. Some saw them as opportunists, others viewed them as loyal soldiers stepping up when needed. Regardless, their prominence wouldn't have been possible without Dodington's temporary collapse. This was less about individual charisma and more about timing. With one enemy temporarily neutralized, Gooch reshaped Manchester's street map. But balance never lasts forever. Dodington would eventually regroup, bringing with them new energy, old grudges and a thirst to reclaim what was lost. For a fleeting moment in the mid-2000s, Cabo and Piggy were the most talked about names on the street. Not because they founded Gooch or redefined the gang's legacy, but because they embodied its current state, aggressive, reactive and momentarily unrivaled. These weren't household names nationwide, but in Manchester they were forces. Their era was defined by calculated moves, brash public displays and ruthless enforcement. With Dodington in shambles and older Gooch heads either imprisoned or less active, Cabo and Piggy seized the spotlight. Under their influence, Gooch became louder, more visible. Whether it was music, fashion or social media, their presence expanded beyond street corners into cultural spaces. They didn't just represent the gang's muscle, they were part of its brand. They inspired loyalty among some and envy from others. Their actions, though brutal, were often strategic. They enforced boundaries, retaliated against perceived threats, and managed to build a short-lived aura of invincibility. But what made their time significant wasn't just their actions, it was the context. They rose during a power vacuum, a time when Manchester's underworld was undergoing a reshuffle. With little oversight and huge territory to control, their aggression filled a void. Their leadership, however, lacked the long-term vision of Joyce or the operational control of YG Cog. They were brawlers, not builders, and their reign, though impactful, was unsustainable. Some say their fame came too fast. Others claim they drew too much attention from police and rivals. Either way, as fast as they rose, they disappeared, folded into the next wave of gang evolution, or swept up in the very violence they propagated. Still, their names remain etched in Manchester folklore, not as founders but as symbols of a volatile chapter, a flashpoint in Gooch history that continues to spark debate. Why do some names stick while others fade? Why do Cabo and Piggy dominate narratives while early Gooch pioneers go unnamed? It's a question of visibility, not value. The earliest members of Gooch built the foundation, but they didn't have camera phones or drill videos. Their impact was real, but undocumented. Back in the 1980s and early 1990s, stories were passed down through word of mouth, not through viral content. What happened in the shadows stayed in the shadows unless it made the news, and even then, the reporting was often skewed. In contrast, Cabo and Piggy emerged during an era of increasing media attention. The early 2000s brought with it the rise of social media, more aggressive tabloid coverage, and a cultural fascination with gangland narratives. Their actions were captured, shared, and debated. Their story, or a version of it, spread rapidly, often losing accuracy along the way. And so, history becomes distorted, not maliciously, but inevitably. What gets remembered isn't always what mattered most. Sometimes it's just what made the loudest noise. Stories of youth carrying knives, flashing cash, and referencing Gooch in rap lyrics attracted far more attention than the slower, grittier evolution of the gang's foundation. Today, we live in an era where content rules perception. What's seen is what's believed. And for many, the story of Gooch begins and ends with whoever went viral or made headlines. But that's not history. That's a highlight reel. And highlight reels by nature leave out the grind, the struggle, the silent chapters that were just as important, if not more so. There were pioneers who didn't chase attention, elders who laid down codes of conduct, who negotiated peace behind closed doors, who kept younger members from making reckless moves. These contributions rarely make it into songs or interviews, but they were essential to the gang's longevity and influence. That's why comments like the one prompting this video matter. They come from those who were there, or knew those who were. People who want the full story told, not just the headline version. It's not about glorifying gang culture. It's about truth, accuracy, giving due credit to every chapter, not just the sensational ones. We owe it to these communities and to the truth to remember fully, to acknowledge the groundwork laid in silence, the youth who stood their ground before fame or infamy, who created something out of nothing in a system stacked against them. Let this be a reminder. Gooch isn't defined by one or two figures. It's a tapestry woven over decades. And understanding that means giving voice to those who laid the groundwork in silence. So next time someone mentions Gooch and drops names like Cabo and Piggy, ask them about the 80s, about the early lieutenants, about the teenagers who walked those streets before drill beats and headlines. Ask them who taught the teachers, because the real history of Gooch isn't just loud, it's layered, and it's time we remembered all of it. As early Dodington members returned from prison in the late 2000s, the landscape began to shift. The power vacuum that Gooch had filled was no longer empty. Familiar faces reappeared in Longsight and surrounding areas. Old alliances resurfaced. New boundaries were set. This resurgence didn't trigger all-out war, but it complicated things. Gooch no longer had free rein. Every move now came with a response. Some younger Dodington members came with a different mindset. They weren't just reclaiming turf, they were evolving. Smarter operations, more covert dealings, and encrypted communication became the norm. These new wave members embraced modern trends in UK crime, county lines, laundering through businesses and staying low-key. They had learned from the mistakes of their predecessors, surveillance, snitches and media attention, and chose to move differently. Their return didn't go unnoticed. Gooch factions braced for a challenge. Some welcomed it, others saw it as a threat. The streets were watching. Every encounter, every lyric, every postcode shift carried meaning. Once bitter enemies at war, the two crews now operated in a complex, calculated environment. Police scrutiny was tighter, communities more cautious, but old grudges simmered beneath the surface. In this new era, conflict wasn't loud. It was quiet, subtle and coded. In Instagram posts, drill lyrics and sideways glances, violence hadn't vanished. It had adapted. Some Dodington elders urged restraint. They had seen the cost, prison, funerals, families torn apart. But for others, the urge to regain lost respect proved stronger than caution. Meanwhile, Gooch recalibrated. Some doubled down. Others stayed low, sensing the shifting power dynamics. Manchester had changed. The names were different. The game had new rules. But the history, shared and scarred, remained in every street, remembered by every OG. This wasn't a return to the past. It was something new, something more calculated, and in many ways, more dangerous. Gooch isn't just a gang. It's a legacy, one that has changed over decades, carrying different meanings for different generations. For some, it's a symbol of survival and loyalty. For others, it represents a cycle of violence and pain. But one thing is clear, its story is more nuanced than the headlines ever showed. From the 1980s to the 2020s, the Gooch narrative shifted with the times. It started with young men protecting each other from systemic racism and economic abandonment. It grew into an organized operation during the YG Cog era and gained mythic status during the reign of figures like Cabo and Piggy, names that became shorthand for a much bigger structure. Today, Gooch is no longer a centralized organization. It's a name, a brand, a legend. It appears in lyrics, online posts, and coded speech. Some wear it like a badge, others invoke it to intimidate, but fewer truly understand its roots. For Manchester's youth, this disconnect can be dangerous. When stories are passed down without context, they risk becoming glamorized. When violence is remembered more vividly than its causes, the same mistakes get repeated. That's why telling the full story matters, not just for nostalgia, but for community memory. Authorities often struggle to grasp this. They react to symptoms, stabbings, shootings, videos, without understanding the long arcs behind them. Gooch wasn't created in a vacuum. It grew out of decades of systemic failure. While individuals must be accountable, so must the system. Efforts to address gang culture must go beyond arrests. It's about mentorship, jobs, creative outlets, role models who understand the streets, not just the data. Programs that meet youth where they are before the pull of postcode pride takes hold. Some grassroots organisations in Manchester are doing this work. Often led by ex-gang members, they speak a language the youth understand. They remember the names not found in news articles, the boys who never made it to adulthood. Gooch's legacy isn't finished, it's still being written. Every time a young person picks up a book instead of a blade, that legacy evolves. We honour the past by telling it truthfully. We protect the future by learning from it. Stay safe, stay sharp, and never forget the roots.